Identical Chinese twins were shocked when the lone rancher slept with them. The year was 1886, and the Wyoming Territory was a raw, open wound on the map of the West, a place where the relentless wind seemed determined to scour away not just the topsoil, but the very distinction between progress and destruction. For Rowan Croft, a rancher whose land stood squarely in the path of Corbin Thorne's Union Pacific Railroad, the world was the worn leather of his saddle and the unending thunder of dynamite. He'd buried his wife on a rise overlooking this valley 3 years ago, a victim of the fever that respected neither fence lines nor fortunes, and since then, the fight had become less about land and more about refusing to let the last piece of her be devoured by another man's ambition. The railroad baron, Thorne, was a man who spoke of the land in terms of conquest. "We are not laying track, Mr. Croft," he had once said in a rare, condescending meeting, "we are suturing the continent together with steel. Your ranch is merely a stubborn piece of gristles." On the other side of Thorne's relentless march, local ranchers, settlers, and the displaced tribes fought a losing battle against that brutal suture. Caught in the crushing middle were the Chinese laborers, brought in by the thousands to blast through granite and lay the track, then discarded like broken tools when the work was done or their bodies gave out. They were ghosts in their own lives, hated by the white settlers as a foreign menace and exploited by the employers who saw them as cheaper than mules. Phone, the unforgiving leader of the local Tong, had ordered his people to resist. To vanish into the hills, to become shadows with knives, to fight to the last. There was no surrender in their vocabulary. That was the catechism Rowan had learned by heart. So when he and his men stumbled upon a hidden encampment in the abandoned silver mine north of his property, they expected only 2 outcomes: a final, desperate fight with hatchets and improvised weapons, or the grim silence of mass suicide, a horror whispered about in the bunkhouses. What they found instead was a handful of terrified, half-starved Chinese men and a small group of women, their traditional silk tunics tattered and stained with grime and rock dust. They had been cooks and laundresses for the railroad gangs, but the haunted look in their eyes told a more complicated story. Among them were 2 young women, identical twins named Lian and Mai. They couldn't have been more than 19, their faces such perfect mirror images that the rough men who found them momentarily paused, caught off guard by the uncanny symmetry and the squalor. Lian's face was a mask of stoic resolve, a stillness she had perfected to shield her younger sister. But her hands, clenched into tiny fists at her side, betrayed a terror so profound it was almost silent. Mai, standing shoulder to shoulder with her sister, could not conceal her fear as effectively. It trembled at the corner of her lips and widened her dark, expressive eyes. The stories told in the camps had been vivid and clear. The American ranchers were Gwai Lo, white devils, brutal men who would inflict unspeakable horrors upon captured women before leaving their bodies for the coyotes. Lian and Mai had recited the oaths together, death before dishonor. Yet when the moment came, when the towering, dust-covered foreigners stormed their sanctuary with rifles held at the ready, the final sharp release of death did not materialize. Instead, there was shouting in a harsh, guttural language, the glint of steel barrels, and then a strange, almost baffling order. The men were separated from the women, and the women were herded towards Rowan's ranch, a few miles south across the rolling sagebrush. There was no brutality, no leering smiles, just a weary, methodical efficiency that was somehow more unnerving. The processing was a blur of confusion. A grizzled old ranch hand named Harlan, his face a road map of sun and suspicion, briefly examined them for injuries with a brusque indifference. They were given a small portion of jerky and water from a clean barrel, the tough, salty meat and cool water a shock to their systems. Then they were led into a large, sturdy barn. The air inside was thick with the rich scent of hay, horses, and dry wood. It was there that Lian and Mai saw it, a row of simple wooden bunks built against the far wall, each with a thin straw-stuffed mattress and a single coarse wool blanket. To the ranchers, it was standard bunkhouse furniture. To the twins, who had spent the last 2 months sleeping on thin reed mats laid upon the cold, damp earth of the mine floor, it was an unimaginable luxury. As dusk settled, casting long, eerie shadows across the valley, a new wave of confusion washed over them. The American ranchers, Rowan and his hands, began to file into the same barn. They didn't speak to the Chinese women, barely even looked at them. They simply walked to their own bunks, arranged along the opposite wall, shucked off their dusty boots with groans of relief, and lay down. They were mere feet away. Mai's heart hammered against her ribs, and she instinctively reached out, her fingers finding Leanne's wrist in the dim light. In their culture, the proximity of unmarried men and women in a sleeping arrangement was a violation of the deepest codes of conduct. It was a prelude to shame, an invitation to dishonor. The twins and the other women exchanged fleeting, terrified glances. They were trapped. The devils were all around them. Yet, as the minutes turned into an hour, nothing happened. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic boom of Thorn's dynamite, the mournful cry of a coyote, and the soft, steady breathing of the sleeping men. They had simply gone to sleep. They lay on their backs, their hats and gun belts beside their bunks, vulnerable in their exhaustion. They were not monsters in the dark. They were just tired men. This profound, inexplicable disconnect between expectation and reality was more terrifying than any anticipated cruelty. The enemy was supposed to be a caricature of evil, a simple target for hatred. But this quiet, unassuming humanity was a puzzle they could not comprehend. Leanne lay stiffly on the strange, yielding surface of the bunk, her body a knot of tension, her hand still holding Mai's. "They are testing us," Mai whispered, her voice a faint tremor against Leanne's ear. "It is a trick." "Be still," Leanne whispered back, her own voice tight. "Watch. Learn. We are alive. That is all that matters for now." The comfort of the bed felt like a trap, the silence a lie. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Yet the only real battle was the one raging inside them, a war between a lifetime of indoctrination and the bewildering evidence of their own senses. Out there in the dust and the dark, Corbin Thorne was pushing his iron horse forward, and Foam was preparing his followers for resistance. But for Leanne and Mai, the entire world had contracted to the space of this barn, to the few feet of air that separated them from the sleeping enemy. The dawn arrived not with light, but with a change in the cadence of violence. The morning brought the frantic crackle of rifle fire, closer now. The ranchers awoke with the practiced groans of exhausted men. Rowan Croft felt the familiar ache in his lower back as he sat up. His eyes scanned the barn, first his own men, then his livestock, and finally the silent row of Chinese women. He saw their fear, but it was a different fear now, a watchful, unnerving stillness. His gaze briefly met Leanne's before she quickly looked away. He noticed a small, festering cut on her hand, inflamed and angry-looking. It needed cleaning. That was his job. Fix what was broken. He approached them slowly, holding up a small tin of salve and a clean rag. "It's okay," he said softly. The twins flinched in unison, Mai positioning herself slightly in front of Leanne. Rowan stopped, holding his hands out, palms open. He pointed to Leanne's cut, then to his tin, a simple pantomime of help. After a long, tense moment, Leanne hesitantly extended her hand. His touch was professional and surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wound, the sting of the antiseptic making her gasp. He worked in silence, his movements economical and sure. When he was done, he wrapped a clean strip of cloth around her palm and offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Leanne stared at the white bandage. Devils did not tend to wounds. "Don't get too friendly with them," Rowan, Harlan grumbled from across the barn. "My brother was killed by tong hatchet men building the pass at Donna. They caught him alone, unarmed. Smiled at him 1 minute, carved him up the next. They're all the same. 2 faces on every one of them. She's a girl, Harlan." "And that cut could go bad," Rowan replied, not looking up. "She's one of them," Harlan shot back. "And there's 2 of them, identical. I see the way they watch everything. Their eyes ain't scared. They're counting. Counting men, counting rifles." "Don't be a fool," he spat a stream of tobacco juice near the barn door. Rowan didn't answer. He knew Harlan's hatred was a scar, deep and permanent, and you couldn't reason with a scar. That evening, the routine repeated itself. This time, the twins watched Rowan. They saw him meticulously clean his rifle. They saw him sit on the edge of his bunk and pull a worn leather wallet from his vest pocket. He opened it and stared for a long time at a small, creased photograph inside. A flicker of deep, painful longing crossed his face. It was an expression they understood perfectly, the look of a man who desperately wanted to be somewhere else, with someone else. The broad, monolithic fear of the white devil was beginning to fracture, replaced by 1,000 smaller questions about this one man. Harlan's open hostility was, in its own way, more comforting than Rowan's quiet decency. You knew how to react to hatred. How were you supposed to react to kindness from your sworn enemy? Several days bled into one another. A fragile truce formed. The twins and the other women were given simple chores, mending clothes, peeling vegetables for the meager meals. It was during one of these afternoons, while they sat in the sliver of shade by the barn, that Harlan approached. He stopped a few feet away, watching them with his hawk-like intensity. "You think you're clever," he said, not to anyone in particular. "Biding your time. Waiting for your chance." My dropped a potato, startled. Leanne simply continued her work, her fingers moving deftly with the needle, not giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. His presence was a constant, oppressive weight, a reminder of the chasm that still existed between them. The breaking point arrived with a scream and a flash of orange fire. Thorne's men, in a bold move to drive Rowan off his land for good, launched a direct raid at dusk. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. Sticks of dynamite arced through the twilight sky. The world dissolved into a cacophony of splintering wood, the terrified shrieks of horses, and the screams of men. The air, thick moments before with hay and sweat, now tasted of burnt powder and iron. Rowan was thrown against a support beam, his head ringing. He scrambled to his feet, a frantic calm descending. "Lights! Get the lanterns," he yelled. Men were groaning. One ranch hand lay eerily still. And Finn, the young ranch hand Rowan had been mentoring, was on the ground, a large dark stain rapidly spreading across his chest from a wound high on his shoulder. In the chaos, Harlan scrambled for his rifle, his eyes darting to the Chinese women huddled in terror. "On the ground! All of you, now!" he shrieked. To him, this was the moment he had predicted. Rowan was a whirlwind of motion. He saw Finn and knew it was bad. A wood splinter had acted like shrapnel, severing an artery. "I need pressure on Finn," he yelled. But the other able-bodied men were wounded, in shock, or returning fire. Harlan was too busy keeping his rifle aimed at the huddled women. Finn was bleeding out. Leanne and Mai saw it all. They saw Harlan's hate-filled face and Rowan's desperate one. They saw the pulsing wound, and Leanne knew he had only moments to live. The voice of foam screamed in her head. "The enemy is weak. This is your chance." Mai gripped her sister's arm, her knuckles white, her face a plea to stay hidden, to survive. But another image pushed through Leanne's panic, Rowan gently bandaging her hand. "I said stay down!" Harlan bellowed at them. But Leanne was no longer listening. She pulled her arm from Mai's grasp and was moving. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she crossed the invisible line that divided the barn. She ignored Harlan's rifle and fell to her knees beside the dying young man. Without hesitating, she pressed the heel of her hand directly into the wound, pushing down with all her weight. The gush of hot blood soaked her hands and forearms. For a heartbeat, Mai was frozen in terror. Then, seeing her sister alone in the center of the chaos, she scrambled after her, falling to her knees on the other side of Finn, adding her own small hands to Leanne's, reinforcing the life-saving pressure. The raid ended as suddenly as it began. An unearthly silence descended. Rowan, having stabilized another man, turned and saw the scene. He froze. The identical Chinese girls were covered in an American rancher's blood, their faces masks of intense concentration. Harlan stood over them, his rifle lowered, his face a disbelieving wreck of confusion and shock. The lines were gone. There was no American side or Chinese side. There was only the living, the dying, and a single, impossible act of mercy. In the adrenaline-fueled aftermath, Leanne and Mai became Rowan's silent, efficient deputies. They worked in a synchronized tandem born of their shared life, their movements a fluid, unspoken language. Rowan would point, and one would bring a cloth while the other held a compress. Harlan simply stood, a ghost in his own drama, his conviction shattered. When the last of the wounded were made as comfortable as possible, the twins finally stood, their bodies trembling. They turned to rejoin the other Chinese women. But as they approached, the women shrank away. One of them whispered the word Hanjian, traitor. Their act of mercy was, to them, an act of ultimate betrayal. In saving an enemy's life, they had become outcasts. Rowan saw the exchange. He saw the crushing isolation descend on the twins. A few minutes later, he approached them with a bucket and a basin of clean water. He said nothing, simply set it down before them and walked away. The act was louder than any words. As Leanne and Mai plunged their hands into the cool water, watching the Americans' blood swirl and dissipate, they felt a strange and terrifying sense of release. They were unmoored, adrift between two worlds, belonging to neither. News of the incident traveled with the speed of frontier gossip. By the next afternoon, it reached Mr. Fletcher, an agent for Corbin Thorne's railroad. He arrived in a buggy that was conspicuously clean, his suit crisp, his eyes holding a polite but analytical sharpness. "Mr. Croft," Fletcher began, "I understand you have cooperative assets among the Chinese you're harboring." "They're cooks, Mr. Fletcher." "They just reacted," Rowan said defensively. Their reaction demonstrated a capacity for logical self-preservation, Fletcher countered smoothly. "That makes them valuable. Mr. Thorne is desperate for information on Feng's main stronghold in the Blackstone Hills. Prisoners who understand that cooperation is a better alternative to starvation are prisoners we can work with. I'm here to ask them a few questions." The interrogation took place in the main house. The twins sat side by side on a wooden chair. Rowan insisted on being present, standing by the door like a reluctant guard. Fletcher unrolled a topographical map. "We know Feng has a command post somewhere in this sector," he said, his finger tapping a grid of canyons. "You were with them, weren't you?" The twins stared at the map. They knew the place. To give it up would be the final, unforgivable act of betrayal. To refuse, what would this powerful man do? They looked at Rowan, who stood grim-faced, powerless. Fletcher leaned forward, his voice a confidential whisper. "Young Finn has a mother and 2 sisters. You saved their son and brother. Help us save more American sons. Help us end this conflict. Tell me where the stronghold is." The silence was a physical weight. The twins exchanged a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance. It was a silent consensus forged in the darkness of the barn and the chaos of the raid. It wasn't about choosing a side. It was about